Good afternoon. Thank you for inviting us to join the briefing session of the Hong Kong Economic Policy Challenge. EY has a very long history of collaborating with HKEPC. We are always put a strong emphasis on supporting academic activities. And nurturing talent is an important step in building a better working world. We explore new ways and create opportunities for students like you so that you can gain new experience to develop your skill set and help you thrive in the transformative age. The Economic Policy Challenge is a wonderful exercise for you to practice and improve your skills. It is also an excellent opportunity for you to apply your classroom knowledge in the real world. The challenge of this year is to solve the Hong Kong housing problem. It is a worldwide issue and is particularly relevant and important to Hong Kong. The unaffordability of housing in Hong Kong has become severe in recent years, and owning a property has become out of reach for many. This is a fascinating topic to kickstart the first Economic Policy Challenge, and we look forward to receiving your innovative solutions. Today is a great occasion for us to interact and exchange our point of views. My colleague Marina from Infrastructure Advisory is going to share with you our insights on how Hong Kong housing market and provide some advices on conducting research. We hope that our sharing can help you with new perspectives in analyzing the issues. So Marina, over to you.
Thanks, Tony, and good afternoon, everyone. I might just quickly pop up a screen that I like to share. Just give me 1 second. Can everyone see that?
Yeah, we can see it. Okay,
excellent. So I'm going to spend the next 10 minutes or so to talk through 3 things. So the first one is I'd like to provide sort of some insights on Hong Kong's housing problem, and then very briefly talk about some of the practices initiatives that EY has in the housing sector, and finally wrap up with some of my tips on how you might want to conduct the research on this topic. So I'll move quickly on to the first discussion, which is the insights on Hong Kong's housing problem. So the first question is, what has been driving the housing affordability crisis in Hong Kong? And essentially our insights is that, which is not unknown to everyone in Hong Kong, is that a sizable portion of the local population cannot achieve their dream of home ownership. And specifically low and middle income households have been the most impacted, with average property prices now, or recent times, 19.4 times the annual household income. So the property market has skyrocketed in Hong Kong over the last decade, and the prices in the city has tripled than what they were about 10 years ago. This can be attributed to 4 key drivers. The first one is low supply of land. So ready to develop land is becoming a scarce resource in Hong Kong. The second one is low interest rate environment. Essentially what that means is that it allows potential buyers to have a lower monthly mortgage repayment, and thus driving further demand for property in the city. The third point is around cultural preferences. So the Chinese cultural belief that owning a flat is the origin of family, and it provides the greatest security. And finally, the attraction of Hong Kong to overseas investors, in particular investors from the mainland who have to date viewed Hong Kong as a better investment opportunity than in China. What does this actually mean for Hong Kong as a city in practical terms? Well, essentially, we're talking about a couple earning the medium level of income. If they were to buy an entry-level flat of around 5 million Hong Kong dollars, that would leave them with a deposit gap of over 1 million Hong Kong dollars. That's about 33 times the median annual household income in Hong Kong. One of the other insights we have is that another contributing factor to the housing challenge in Hong Kong is that the housing ladder in Hong Kong is not flexible enough to meet current market conditions and household needs. So what we mean by that is housing options for low to middle income households are limited in Hong Kong. So advancing along this property or housing ladder is also quite challenging, so that as there is not enough incentives and options for people to choose from. So essentially Hong Kong's property market is in a gridlock to some extent. If we compared this housing ladder to other markets, we'll see sort of some differences. So you can see on this slide here, we've mapped it against the housing ladder in Australia, for example. So in Hong Kong, there are essentially 4 sort of key housing categories, starting from the public rental housing. You've got the market rental housing, you've got subsidised sale flats, and you've got full ownership at the end of the property ladder. If you were to contrast that with Australia, essentially you've got crisis accommodation as sort of the first pillar, and then moving into social rental housing, which is essentially the same as public rental housing in Hong Kong, although in markets like Australia, the government also provides additional social supports to tenants in social housing, such as welfare and access to social services. You've got the third one, which is affordable rental housing. These are typically these initiatives are typically led by the private sector, and it's targeting low to middle household incomes who have stable employment, but just need some discount from the market rental rates. And then you've got the sort of the private market rental housing, and then you move on to a category called shared ownership. So it's a product whereby a property owner buys a share of the flat, so say 50%, and then the financial institution owns the other portion of the flat, and the buyer can then acquire the remaining share of the property over time. After a certain number of years, they've been a tenant at a significantly lower initial down payment and also lower mortgage repayment. And then you move on to full ownership as well. So there's a diagram up in the top right corner which shows sort of largely what is a split between each of the housing options across Hong Kong. Then we look at some of the past government intervention measures that have been in place, and what we found that these have had little success in resolving the challenge, essentially. Some of these past interventions include lowering the loan-to-value ratio to about 50%. What this does is effectively it increases the size of the down payments and has made home ownership even more difficult for middle income earners. And the impact of this is it's pushed the market towards even smaller flats, and they've driven prices up in those categories, essentially. Secondly, the government has also introduced what they call the subsidised sale flats I mentioned earlier in the housing ladder. So these are programs called, say, the home ownership scheme. They're only available to eligible households within certain income thresholds. But if you look at some of the past releases into the market, they've been oversubscribed by up to 150 times. In 2017, and also the payment of the premium to government on the sale of these properties present a fairly, big challenge for households who might want to exit from these properties and look to move up that property ladder into full ownership. And then finally, some recent introduction of a vacancy tax on property owners aimed mainly at developers were meant to speed up the rate at which the flats are released into the private housing market. But I think as we've seen in some of the reviews today, that's not necessarily generated the sort of extent of the impact that was originally envisaged. And then finally, the government has also assisted a public rental pool the public rental market, but it faces the same pressures as the rest of the Hong Kong market. So there's been over 150,000 general applicants and another 120,000 applicants who are non-elderly or one-person household types. They're all struggling on the waiting list. So about 2 years ago, the average waiting time is over 5 years for general applicants. So what this has meant is that as households, as demand for property has increased, households are turning to smaller spaces and smaller flats. So in 2017, we're talking about over 83,000 households living in subsidized flats, which have an average living area of around 63 or 62 square meters. That's 56% below the average living area space in public rental housing. I've got here a list of some of the more recent government measures which has been introduced and have been rolled out progressively as means to improve the situation. And these might be some of the initiatives that, as part of this policy challenge, you might want to explore a bit more further and understand what the impacts might be. Things like the ongoing execution of the long-term housing strategy, the government's implementation of the single site multiple use initiative, what the NGOs have started to do in the transitional housing space, developing brownfield sites in the new territories. There's a lot of discussion around Land Tower Tomorrow and what that could mean for Hong Kong in terms not only as in a significant increase in land and therefore housing supply, but also improving living environment and equality standards as well. And then finally, the introduction of land sharing pilot scheme. Looking at all these initiatives, our main observation is that both government and the private sector have a role to play, and that new policies and initiatives should be encouraging these parties to cooperate even more in order to direct housing supply to those with the greatest need. I've just skimmed through this very quickly. As you can probably hear, I've got an Australian accent. So I am from Australia, and in Australia, in our EY practice, we have done quite a lot of projects and initiatives for the various state governments across the country. And this just goes to show that there are a lot of activity and a lot of investment that government could place in helping to improve housing. This might be, I guess, some reference point for people to look into to see what's going on in other parts of the world. And then finally, just I've got 3 tips for the research. The first one is, so all this discussion around the lack of housing has heightened the focus on increasing land supply as a primary means of increasing house supply. So while this is a realistic option, it's a long-term one. So my question would be, what are some of the short to medium-term steps that Hong Kong can take to alleviate the shortage of affordable housing for its citizens? The second one is, building on that, in the short to medium term, how can we improve access to affordable housing for low to middle income households in Hong Kong? So there are some discussions that there is actually sufficient supply of housing in the market, but have they been made accessible to the right people who need it the most? So Hong Kong is not alone in facing these challenges, and some initiatives and policies around improving accessibility overseas has been proven successful. So a suggestion may be to look at some other benchmarks for ideas. And then finally, the success does rely on cooperation between government and private sector to increase and direct supply to housing to those with the greatest need. So my question would be, what could greater cooperation between government and private sector look like in Hong Kong, and what could it achieve? Thank you. That ends my presentation. Back to you, Thomas.
Thank you so much, Marina and Tony. That was very insightful, honestly. I now want to pass it on to Patrick and Michael of Bloomberg to discuss what Bloomberg Intelligence is doing.